All right, so welcome and good day here. Talking with Jared Schrieber, the co-founder and CEO of InfoScout, which was acquired in June of 2017 by MarketTrack with Vista Equity Partners backing. And later on, InfoScout and MarketTrack were combined to form Numerator, where Jared continues to serve on the board of directors. One of the reasons that I picked out Jared for this discussion about growth and culture and how the two come together is that I had the honor and privilege of succeeding Jared as not as the CEO of InfoScout, but as general managing and leading InfoScout through the integration with MarketTrack and in the ultimate sort of rebranding of the company as Numerator. So I had a firsthand chance to see what the InfoScout culture was like. This is a company that, why don't I turn it over to Jared and let him actually describe, both a little bit about his background and about the company, and then we can dig in a little bit deeper.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Alex. And pleasure to reconnect.
Yeah.
So, background-wise, look, I just fell in love with working with data in my first job at Intel out of college. My job was to pull together data from across the supply chain and figure out what the heck was going on. Create metrics, create forecasts, do optimization. It was my first exposure to business and data, and I just fell in love working with data to build decision support tools and systems. Decided that's what I wanted to do, and had an entrepreneurial bent to me. Wanted to build those systems not within a company, but across an industry in a way that could shape an industry. So that led me on to MIT and then on to Teradata, where I started working with point of sale data and point of sale data analytics for the first time. Then joined a very early stage startup that was working with the first RFID data in retail back in 03 and 04 at the top of that hype cycle, and integrating it with POS data to help brands better work with retailers. And then from all of that work, we grew a business from 0 to 40 million in revenue pretty quickly, but kind of plateaued. And from that, realized that there were still a lot of business questions that brands couldn't answer with store level point of sale data, that they really needed to understand from the actual consumer behavior, how they were responding to promotions, advertising, pricing, merchandising, and other effects. And so this is back, let's call it 2011. And smartphone adoption in the US was starting to pick up. You had a third of households with at least one smartphone back then, hard to believe. Europe was pretty far ahead. I think 2/3 of households in Europe had a smartphone by that time. And just writing was on the wall that everybody's going to have one of these devices, and it's going to change how brands can engage consumers. It'll open up mobile crowdsourcing and other opportunities. And so with John Braylig, who had worked with me at the prior company and had been successful as an entrepreneur a couple other times, we got back together and founded InfoScout with the idea of incentivizing consumers to use our mobile apps to take pictures of their everyday shopping receipts. No matter where they shopped or what they bought, they take a picture or receipt, we'd give them an incentive, and we'd get to use the anonymized data to help brands understand consumer behavior. And that was the genesis of InfoScout.
Yeah, and it's an incredible story. I mean, one thing that really stands out about your background, Jared, is you're definitely an example of an individual who had like a significant amount of really deep domain expertise, as you said, from your initial sort of work with Intel, and then later with Retail Solutions, which was the company that you were talking about, that reached $40 million in sales, and staying in that industry for an extensive period of time, and then identifying that opportunity and sort of seeing the disconnects in the offerings that were available in the market, coupled with this new innovation, as you said, of a smartphone, and how to make it more convenient for consumers. So incredible kudos to you around identifying that opportunity and then going and pursuing it. InfoScout, I think we talked about the numbers, was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $12 million run rate, growing about 100% a year when it was acquired in June of 2017.
Right.
And it's not a company that's super, well known. It's very well known in the market intelligence industry, developed an incredible reputation, and continues that day, to this day with Numerator, which is really a disruptor in the space. and continues to be very dynamic, with respect to other competitors like Nielsen and IRI and so on. And a lot of that sort of culture has come, I think, from not only sort of what was there before, but like InfoScout, I think was a company that like punched above its weight class, if you like, in terms of reputation and culture. And I know that when I came in and succeeded you and had that, like I said, that privilege of doing that, this is a company that was growing really quickly, but was hitting on all cylinders. I mean, you had 180 people more or less at the time when we did that transition in Puerto Vallarta. And I remember, Glassdoor rating was 4.8. And I remember just being blown away by how dynamic and engaged and excited and enthusiastic and collaborative, intelligent, the team was. And it was just a great experience to like take on that team and help it through, the integration. So, what really kind of came to mind about you was just, what are some tips and tricks that you can share with other entrepreneurs and startups and early stage companies about how to create a great growth culture? Because at the end of the day, as we both know, it's not just about culture, nor is it just about growth. It's like ideally, you get both of those and how they actually connect with one another. So, tell me a little bit about like when you think about culture and growth and you think about InfoScout, like how did you think about that as you were building the company? Going away from the technical aspects to really sort of the soul and the heartbeat and and how you wanted, what you wanted to infuse in the company as you were creating it.
Yeah, and I wish, some of it's hindsight is 2020. Some of it you figure out as you go along, and others, sometimes you have enough foresight to do things right. And to be frank, when it comes to building the company culture, I think there was a bit of all three that played a factor. One of the things that I knew as we founded the company was we wanted everybody to be owners in the company, and we wanted people who had an entrepreneurial spirit themselves to take ownership in the company, that they felt like they were entrepreneurs as well versus they were people doing a job for entrepreneurs. And in fact, later on, a couple of years into the company, when we set our core values, we're all entrepreneurs was one of the core values that we set to instill that. And of course, that meant stock options for every employee, even the sales reps, even the most junior people, but also empowering people to make decisions themselves as if they were the boss and in charge. And and I think that's the other aspect of culture that hit me a little bit later. There's a great phrase out there that says culture's in charge when the boss isn't around. And and when you're in a B2B startup as a CEO, you can't be around all the time. One, we had a workforce that was spread out across the country. It wasn't just headquarters concentrated. We had sales and services people where our customers were across the country, not just in San Francisco headquarters. And two, I had to be out with them, working with clients and selling to prospects and fundraising and other activities. I couldn't be in the office all the time. So who's in charge when the boss isn't around? Culture's in charge. So you better get that right. And that's one of the most important things of what culture becomes for a company. And the reason why that saying culture eats strategy for breakfast rings true.
Yeah, and I guess just for everyone's context, so I mean, the company was initially started in the Bay Area, and so you had obviously a good team there. Later on, offices in Chicago, New York as well, and you had also a very extensive, as you said, remote team. Whether it's like especially sales and services, but I think quite frankly, really got a sense of you wanted to find the best people wherever they were, and you didn't want to be limited by geography.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. That was a very conscious choice that we just needed the best people, regardless of whether or not they were located in San Francisco. In fact, we also wanted to be very customer friendly in terms of how we worked. We were in business to help our customers grow their brands. And if it was better to do that by sitting side by side with them or hiring people who used to work for them or with them. And that was a very common thing we do. We'd ask prospects or customers, hey, who's the best shopper insights person you've ever worked with? Who's the best consultant from our competitors that you've worked with? And then we'd go out and try and hire those people.
Yeah, great strategy. So yeah, great strategy around finding the right people. It's like asking, who are the best people? It's really interesting, of course, in these COVID days, we talk about sort of remote first or, going to go back to the office or whatever. But I mean, yours is, InfoScout was a company where you set it up to be hybrid right from the very beginning. Again, to your
Mhm.
point, like, let's just find the best people. So when you think about that from a culture perspective, how were you able to sort of infuse, that InfoScout, that unique sort of culture that you built when you've got people in different offices and remote and so on? Like, how would you bring everybody together in, on sort of, what InfoScout was and as you said, like how things would operate when you weren't always there, either physically present or even
Right.
remotely present. Let's say if you weren't, on Slack for a little while or whatever, like,
Sure.
how would you create that?
There's a few things. One is I'd worked in large organizations where it felt to me that knowledge was power and that people who had some kind of knowledge advantage by being at headquarters or closer to an executive had some information that others didn't. And all of a sudden they leveraged that as some kind of power for themselves or throwing sharp elbows with this privileged knowledge. And John and I really did everything we could to prevent that from being the case. That basically one of our core values was to be transparent to a fault. So we didn't want certain people having certain information that wasn't shareable across the organization. And we didn't ever share things at headquarters before we would share them with the people who were remote. So one of the important aspects of how you manage a remote team like that is we had weekly all hands calls and meetings. Of course, most of the people or half the people would be in the room there in San Francisco, but the other half would be online remotely, and we would share updates and information real time with everybody through that forum. And a lot of the updates and information were actually coming from people out in the field who were working with clients and customers and doing other work. And so it wasn't just one way from headquarters out, it was two way. And there was never a time or a closeness advantage to information by being in headquarters versus being remote.
Yeah. Yeah, and just again for context for everyone, so what InfoScout held was something called Weekly Wednesday, and it was a ritual, as you said, and
Mm-hmm.
it was Wednesday 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern time, and one of the things that struck me about that meeting was, like the people really looked forward to it. Everybody looked forward to it because I think it was like a chance for everybody to reconnect, number one, but number two, that there was really valuable information being imparted there. It might be updates from, you or later on me or, others on the team. It could be, the services team identifying some new way of serving a client. It could be new success story, new product features, capabilities. And there was always some planning into the agenda. It was an hour long. It was, there was a lunch involved and so on. But I remember just everybody was eager, for Weekly Wednesday, and you wouldn't think of missing it.
Which is strange, right? Because we've all been a part of regular company update meetings, and it's just like, oh my God, not another one of these. And I really think because we were so open and transparent and sharing information and putting it in context for people to try and help them have a fuller understanding so that they could be entrepreneurial themselves and really think holistically about the business and what it meant for the business. I think people valued that at the end of the day. And I think that's why people were eager. They didn't want to miss a Weekly Wednesday. They didn't want to miss, more information being shared, learning about others, what's happening in other parts of business and having it put into the context of how it might impact them and what they do in their job.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned John, and I mean, huge shout out to John, obviously, who's, like an
Definitely.
incredible entrepreneur, in his own right, has done a number of successful companies and is, on the verge of, I'm sure launching another game changer in Cascade that we
Indeed.
look forward to, hearing about in the years to come. And I'm sure that he was a fundamental part of that whole process as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, you mentioned sort of like values and you said transparency, and like one of the values you mentioned, or that I know was sort of existed in the company was transparency to a fault.
Yes.
And I love that wording. And, earlier on you said, hey, a couple of years in when we got around to doing the mission and vision and so on. So I was going to ask about that. Like, did you, did you have sort of like something in mind around mission, vision, values at the very start, or was it more like, hey, let's just kind of get started on this and then we'll figure it out. And then somewhere along the way, you said, whoa, we should really take a step back and do this because maybe things are starting to go a little bit askew and we need to sort of, kind of rein them in a little bit. Like, how did that evolve for you?
Somewhere in between there. I would certainly say that John and I made sure that we had some common values between us in terms of things that we valued in each other, in colleagues, in what we wanted out of a company. And we spent a lot of time talking about that before we ever co-founded the company together. That was important. And I think, fortunately for everybody who was ever involved in InfoScout, I think they saw just how value aligned John and I were as people, and I think it made us easier to work with in a teaming type manner. And I think it benefited the company. That said, we didn't start out the company day one with mission, vision, values, and lay those out. I really would say it was probably after our Series A, about 15 people, and we said, okay, we're starting to scale now. We have a better sense of what our business and go-to-market is. We have a sense of product, direction for product market fit, maybe actually not after our Series A, a little bit further after that, but things started to become clearer in terms of what was the basis by which we were going to compete in the market. What would our differentiators be? How did we need to work and operate? And so the establishment of our core values actually became a way to embed our strategic differentiators into how everybody did their job every day. So transparency to a fault, I think, is not just a great way to work for any company. It was particularly great for us because our competitors were not transparent in terms of how they sourced their data, how they massaged their data, how they got the numbers to represent consumer behavior at the end of the day. And we saw that it was an opportunity of, hey, let's just be honest. Let's show the warts of what's going on. Let's show the raw data. Let's show what's going on. We don't have anything to hide. Our competitors have tons to hide by comparison to what we might think we have to hide. Let's be super transparent. Let's be the opposite of what our competitors are, and let's embed that in our culture so that in everything we do, it just becomes expected and standard, and that'll flow through to our customers. And I think we did that across the board with our different values. They just embedded our strategic differentiators in terms of how everybody operated on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. And when I think about sort of values, I think about integrity, and I mean integrity not just in terms of living to the values, but an integrity and a wholeness and a cohesiveness, which you mentioned, which is not only sort of like how you and your team interact, but how you interact with your board and your investors, and how you interact, with your customers, just like all of that together. It's got to be consistent and cohesive all the way through.
Absolutely, it really does, and it's hard, right? It's not easy, and sometimes you have to make adjustments and course correct and tweak things, but that is the goal. It has to be cohesive. It has to be, it has to cover the most important aspects of the business and not create tension and conflict that's unnecessary. It should be an immediate resolver of conflict, and it's working when you hear side conversations of people trying to decide which way to go, and they say something like, well, that wouldn't be very transparent, would it? And they make the decision based on that. Or look, I think we're empowered to make that decision. Like we'll do it, we'll inform others, we'll find out otherwise, but I think we should just make the call. And you go, yes, it's working.
Yeah. Well, as you said, I mean, that's sort of like when culture works when you're not around, right?
Exactly.
Good.
Exactly.
So what about goal setting? One of the other things that struck me was, I think you did a really effective job of defining really, simple to understand goals, that everybody could rally around. So give us a little bit of your thinking around, you got the values in place and the mission and vision of the company. So you've got this kind of like skeletal, like infrastructure, if you like, but then it's like, all right, how do we harness this and how do we get people moving in, in this direction that we want? So how do you think about goal setting? What is the right kind of goal? How much are you trying to like overachieve versus, we should be able to make this, how simple versus complex, and so on.
That's not an easy one. I'm not sure I've nailed it, but it is an approach that for myself, in terms of holding myself accountable, and therefore hopefully holding others accountable, I feel comfortable with, which is Set your goals high enough that even if you don't achieve them, you will have accomplished more than you otherwise thought possible. Don't set them so high that they just don't even seem within the bound of possibility or reason, or that you yourself don't believe, but you're just trying to aim short of. Set them high enough where you go, man, we really could and should be able to do this. It doesn't mean we're going to, but we really could and should. And that's the kind of bar we want to set for ourselves. And we're going to put, as long as we feel like we can put in place a plan to achieve that people can buy into, then that's the goal we're going to set for ourselves. And hopefully, there were some benchmarks for, if you want to have a SaaS company that is on a trajectory to control its own destiny, whether via IPO, acquisition, staying independent, you name it. There's great data out there from people like Thomas Tungus and David Skoke and others. Bessemer Venture Partners have published, like Byron Dieter. And one of the things I took away from that is, look, once you hit your first million in bookings, triple, triple, double, double, double. That's simple. That's the path to 100 million in revenue. That's the path to having full control of your destiny as a company. That is a winning path to success. There are plenty of companies that have done and achieved that. Once you find enough product market fit to get a million in bookings or a million in revenue, set those kind of goals. Figure out what it takes to triple. It's too easy to figure out what it takes to double. And I know it doesn't sound easy, but honestly, if you've already found that first million of product market fit, figure out what it takes to triple. Do everything you can to achieve it, and then figure out what it takes to triple again. Those are the kind of stretch goals that I think you need to actually achieve. Did we hit that every year? No, but we came pretty darn close. And as a result, I think we had an outstanding, track record, and the company has achieved those kinds of final target numbers that I think most SaaS companies really want to achieve at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the benchmarking is a really good point. And, it's interesting in terms of, I find that entrepreneurs are often limited by the questions they ask themselves. If you sort of, you have a company and you're like, okay, you know what, here's what we got. I've got $1 million in sales, and what can we achieve next year? Like, a different way of asking that might be, how can we achieve 3x?
100%.
And once you
100%.
it sort of like liberates certain kind of thinking, both with yourself and with your team. It's like, all right, how do we achieve this goal? Now, you could also ask yourself, well, how do we achieve 10x? But that might feel like too much of a stretch. And to your point about benchmarking, it's like, hey, you know what? If we can hit this kind of trajectory, we will be extremely highly valued, and it's been done before. There's a sort of roadmap, a playbook.
We'll have access to the capital we need to grow. We will know we were, everything becomes clear. So I would say, that was the core of the goal setting, was really, what does it take to triple next year? What does it take to double next year? Can we put in place a plan to achieve that? And look, sometimes it ended up being 2.7x instead of 3x, or another year instead of 2x it was 2.4x. It's something like that. It's not a hard and fast rule, but by thinking it through and then taking that mindset to the problem, we could figure out what was going to hold us back, what the barriers were, what we'd have to put in place. We were able to make priority calls and establish plans that the entire leadership team could buy into and get their entire teams bought into. And the great thing about it was, everybody knew if we hit those goals that we were successful. Like it was obvious. It wasn't some arbitrary form of success. It would be compellingly obvious to anyone that, damn, that's an impressive business. They're doing great. And we could all feel good about that. And then having the sub goals below it, right? So once you put in place the plans of, like, how will we know we're on track in a way that builds up to this kind of bookings or revenue target at the end of the day, and having a few key that cover, the core different functions of the business that everybody can relate to in some way, shape, or form, even if they're an engineer on a mobile app versus they're a client services person working with a customer, that they can see how some of these goals relate directly to their work.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something that's incredibly important, which is people in the company knowing what kind of an impact they're having, and feeling like what they're feeling, and beyond feeling, not just perceiving, but knowing that what they're contributing actually has an impact on the end goal, and on the company achieving its objectives. And I like what you also said about externally, that there's a sort of like validation, like, oh yeah, this is a company that's being successful, but that's also important internally, right? Like
Very.
the employees themselves and the team members actually feeling like, wow, we are a company that is, has momentum and we're making our numbers, and, the perception of progress, right?
It has carryover effects every day. It increases everybody's productivity every day when you're winning.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Winning streaks, breeds for productivity and happiness, and losing streaks do the opposite.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right. No.
good. So now, obviously, you can't do this without like an amazing team. And I think it's fair to say you had a pretty amazing team of individuals, whether it's, the leadership team or, in the rest of the company. You got to find the right kind of people and bring in the right kind of talent. So how did you do that? How did you find
Yeah.
great people? Because everybody, like there's an incredible war for talent now. How are you able to identify and attract really strong performers, A, who are also B, a great cultural fit?
Uh, it didn't happen that way at first. I think many of our first hires were not good hires. I think we felt like we were in such a rush to get butts in seats versus finding people who could really be entrepreneurs with us and help grow and build the company for the long run. And I think after the experience of a few hires that weren't the right hires, we took a step back and really said, in our approach to hiring, how are we ensuring we're getting top talent? And what do we need to correct in order to do that? And some of the things that we needed to correct was going into every interview, not having the mindset of why is this person good for the job? Instead, having the mindset of why won't this person work out at the end of the day? If I hire this person, what's gonna cause them to fail in the job? Picking apart every candidate and going in with that mindset of trying to figure out what's wrong with the candidate helps you then really to decide whether or not you can put up with those concerns or issues of a candidate and why they'll truly be a great fit at the end of the day and the risk that you need to manage going in. So that mindset shift. And then the question is, how do you tease that out? So many questions we ask in interviews, we collectively tend to be confirming questions, like they're just softballs, or they come with this confirmation bias attached to them, versus every question you ask, do you know what a bad answer to that question would be? And do you know how likely it is that somebody will answer that question poorly in a way that you can then say, you know what, this person's probably not going to be a fit for this reason. If you don't know the potential answers and likelihood of those answers for each question you're asking in an interview, you're asking the wrong questions. So really understanding what those questions and criteria are going into the interview, and doing it with a mindset of, this person's probably not going to be a good fit. I need to figure out why. I need to figure out what would have me regretting hiring this person 3 months from now, 6 months from now. And so we created case studies that were specific to jobs. We would give real problems that we were facing with that type of work to the person, even though they didn't have the context, and we'd immediately start working with them on the problem with a whiteboard, and seeing if we could collectively problem solve with them. And they were the kind of person we wanted to work with to solve a problem. Those were some of the things that I think we changed that got us on the path of really securing great talent, of people that you just want to work with to solve problems on a day in, day out basis.
Interesting. So you really had a very strong filtering process. Like, I mean, it sounds like it's really sort of like, how do we filter out the individuals, and how do we, as quickly as possible, identify individuals who aren't going to work? And then it's almost like a funnel, like who's making it to the end of the funnel, and then let's engage with them and let's see whether we're really having an enjoyable experience. Like they passed kind of all these filters and criteria. Now let's make sure we actually enjoy working with them.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think that's something that we changed early enough on that it made a huge difference. And then the other thing was interesting to me. I didn't realize maybe how important it was until later. The time we were getting acquired, I had to put together statistics on attrition of employees over the last 12 or 24 months. And I looked at it, and it was a little bit higher than I would have expected. So I started diving in to try and understand. And I looked at it and I said, wow, we have encouraged more employees to go find work elsewhere than we have had people leave the company. So it was a situation where when we found people not to be good fits culturally, with the role, with whatever, we would start having conversations with them early. We'd talk to them in terms of what we're seeing. If we really didn't feel like there was a fit, we would start having that conversation with them, treating them as great people, which they are, but the fit may not be right. And if we couldn't navigate and find towards where that fit was clear, then we would say, hey, over the next few months, we think it would make the most sense for you to find an opportunity elsewhere that maybe fits with your talents, interests, and skills better than what we're seeing here. And I think the way that we handled that at the end of the day was incredibly beneficial to us. One, it made sure all of our existing team members who stayed around knew that we weren't going to put up with problems in performance or how people work together. Like, that was just not going to be how it was, and it was going to last. And two, everybody saw that the way that we treated people was with this sense of dignity and wanting the best for everybody. Yes, we want what's best for us, but we also want what's best for them as individuals. And if you see how you let people go, and if you do that right, then the people who stick around just have all the more confidence and feeling great about the type of company that they work for.
Yeah, I was struck by, the model you had reminded me a lot of, the approach that sort of Bain and Company, I think major consulting firms take, which is, really have sort of, honest, candid conversations with people about where they're at. And then frankly, at a certain point where if it doesn't seem like they're on the track to go to the next level, then really give them a graceful exit. And consulting companies are consistently in the sort of, top 10 best places to work. So I thought you had a very sort of consultative, soft approach, soft landing, if you like, for people.
Yeah.
So, on that note, and we're skipping a bit ahead because I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of like, bring people in, but let's stay on this topic for a bit and then come back to the other one. It's easier to identify not meeting performance, which is typically a more quantitative way of assessing people, than not a great cultural fit, which is a bit more qualitative. So let's dig into that second one. How would you actually determine that someone wasn't a great fit, and how do you have that kind of a conversation where they're making their numbers, or they're getting things done from a performance perspective? What are the types of things that might come up in a conversation that says you're not a great cultural fit?
Very astute question. It's much harder to deal with that circumstance. I've had to deal with it personally a few times with some people I really like as people, but the way that they worked and operated was affecting the ability of their peers and colleagues to do their jobs and do their jobs effectively, and to want to come to work each day and deliver their best. And so, even though I'm thinking one person in particular, they did their job fine. They weren't an outstanding performer. They did well. The way that they went about doing it was really frustrating some of the colleagues, and clearly impacting the collective performance of the group and team. And so look, just as if it were a regular performance issue, just have to be frank with them. I mean, you can't beat around the bush. It's not going to make things any better. You're not helping anybody. Letting it fester, that's only making things worse. So you have to be blunt about it and say, but you have to get specific, right? You can't say in generalities. You have to come up with specific examples that make it real. And I love this process that I learned at Intel when I first became a manager, called the 2-minute coach. And it's basically when you see something that isn't right, or you have an issue that you need to address, you get the person aside and you just simply state what you observed. You don't say it was wrong, bad, I wish you'd have done it differently, whatever. You just say, hey, I noticed when you said this that so-and-so really pulled back or kind of humped or something. And just stop. Don't do it. Don't say anything more. Let the other person then respond to that. One, you're probably going to learn a ton of additional context and how they're thinking about it, or maybe there's other things you didn't know going on behind the scenes. So you as a manager will learn a lot through that process. but it also opens the dialogue to then address why that's negative and why that's not helping the business or helping them be successful in their job or helping their peer be successful in their job. And then so you can walk through how they, you try and work with them to get them to say how they might handle the situation differently next time. And then you kind of remind them of the goal of what it is you're trying to achieve. Look, at the end of the day, here's what we're trying to do. Here's what they're trying to do. Here's what you're trying to do. So, next time this happens, what do you think the best approach is? And try and get them to buy in. And so that's how you start dealing with those issues, right? When you see it, say it. That doesn't mean in public, you do it in private. And the best way I've ever found to do it is you just state what you've observed without any value judgment on top and get the other person to respond and get talking about it. And quite frankly, a third of the time, I find out that I misassessed the situation. I learn new information from that approach where I'm like, damn, good thing I didn't tell them they really screwed up or they're doing something wrong, because I have a misread of the situation. So.
Jared, I think you touched on two things that are like super important there. Number one is, about sort of, listen more and talk less. And so I liked your point about like, don't make an assumption. I think we sometimes just, jump to a conclusion. And so I love your point about just sort of like state something and ask and listen. So that's number one. And then number two, you also, you mentioned about sort of non-judgment. I think it's really important as well. I mean, there's been a ton of research out there and like Google, for example, I'm sure you're aware of this, did a bunch of research on their top producing teams. Mm-hmm. And the mm-hmm. number one sort of factor they found was a feeling of acceptance and safety, that's mm-hmm. cultivated with the group, by the manager, the leader. And so even in the way that you're dealing or that you dealt with, potential sort of like problem or issue cases, it demonstrates that you're creating an environment of safety and acceptance in just even having that discussion, right?
I'd like to think so. I just think that's really important. If people just don't feel comfortable speaking their mind or having an opinion or disagreeing or anything, it's not healthy. It's just not healthy at the end of the day, and I think as leaders, it's our job to role model that when somebody says something you disagree with, the first response isn't to jump down their throat or show how stupid they are, and make yourself look smart in the process. Job is to understand what led them to that conclusion, because more often than not, as a leader, it's your fault that they've ended up down that path. It's your fault because you haven't made it clear enough what the goal is, why the goal is the way it is, what the plan is, what our approach is, what are the clarity of the vision and the strategy and other things that give them enough context to make a decision from an executive view versus make a decision of what's best for them in their particular role, right? If you haven't given them the full context, you can't expect them to exhibit the kinds of behaviors and thinking and conclusions that you would otherwise expect. That's on you as a leader most of the time.
Yeah, great insight. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the sort of like, offboarding, if you like. Let's go back to onboarding. So you've kind of, you've gone through this interview process. And actually, just before onboarding, and there's one other thing which I know from our previous, prior conversations and so on, which I think is worth sort of bringing out here. Were you always involved in interview processes? Were you kind of like a final sort of stamp of approval, if you like, or just vet the candidates, or would you see them every single candidate that came in, or was there a certain point where you stopped doing that? And what was the conversation like that you would have with those individuals?
Sure.
What questions would you ask them that would give you comfort that they were the right kind of person?
That's a good one. So at first, I stayed out of engineering hires. And then after the first 5 or so hires, I inserted myself into that process as well as a final approval. As talented as John and the other leaders were, I learned that as a leader, you have a role to play in that process. And by the way, part of it is two-way because, recruiting top engineering talent is tough. So giving them access to the CEO to ask questions shows that this company values engineers and engineering and can be helpful towards the cause versus a negative, right? So So yes, I interviewed everyone through about 120, 150 employees in terms of size before there were certain roles that I decided I didn't need to be a part of the interview process. And for some roles, it was an hour and stayed an hour all the way up to that scale. And for other roles, we started reducing it to maybe a half hour. And then what was I trying to do? Well, part of it depended on the role and the nature of the role. So the more senior the role, the more I'm trying to understand, are they really able to get their hands dirty? So I'd ask a question like, tell me about the body of your work that you're most proud of and why. And then they'd go start explaining, and I'd start drilling down 5 levels deep to understand if they were just a part of it and a lot of people are doing the work and they just kind of had the role in it, or they really understood in the weeds how this was working, operating, and they were rolling up their sleeves and helping making it happen as an entrepreneur would, for example. I think I'm probably best known for my riddle questions. There's a few riddle questions I've asked. Why? Probably I've got to be approaching 1,000 times now. And so I have this bank of knowledge of how people go about answering them. And I have a bank of knowledge of the people we've ended up hiring and seeing how they play out and perform. And I'm able to relate the two to each other now by asking the same questions over and over and over. And I just want to be clear to everybody, it's not the riddle for the sake of a riddle and getting to the answer. I actually could care less if somebody answers it right in 10 seconds. Most people answer it wrong, and that doesn't disqualify them. What I do is then I start adding additional information or getting them to think about the problem from a different angle, and I see how they work with me. I see how they're able to take in new information and adjust their thinking. Do they have flexibility of mind, or do they get flustered and frustrated? Can they incorporate new information? Can they problem solve collaboratively together to get to a better place? Can they take feedback? Can they handle a setback and failure and recover from it? Those are what I'm trying to get out of this interview that I do at this final level, versus I'm just trying to see how smart they are. Because quite frankly, at the end of the day, we erred on the side of EQ over IQ in our recruiting. There were Google and Facebook and tons of other companies out recruiting tons of talent as well, and it was pretty clear that they were a little bit more focused on maybe the high IQ. And I thought in our line of business and for what we needed as a company and team, look, we want smart people, but a lot of being smart is how you work with others, and EQ matters a lot in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. I will say that as an organization, InfoScout felt like a very sort of extroverted organization. Like, I mean, when they were sort of get together, it's not to say that there obviously weren't people who were introverted, and there were a number of people who were, and so on, and everybody was felt comfortable one way or the other. Back to that sort of like state of acceptance that we talked about. But I remember when we would have offsites, how there was really like people hugging, and there was a real sense of camaraderie amongst the team.
Yeah, I think we're able to foster that. What's funny is, I'm an ambivert. If you did my Myers-Briggs, I'm slightly introverted. John is a healthy mix, I think, of the two. We're not particularly outgoing extroverts necessarily. We can recharge cranking on something in the corner or reading a book, as opposed to feeling like we need to go out and engage. And so, I really do hope we created the kind of environment, whether you're introvert or extrovert, you felt really comfortable. However, I do think we created this sense of friendship and camaraderie that was apparent. And I'm not sure how much of it was extroversion at the end of the day versus we got people together outside of a work environment, like with our annual company offsite, where people were just, having meals together outside of work. They were playing sports together. They were doing funny scavenger hunt challenges together. They were spending time in a hot tub, drinking a margarita at night, just chatting away and telling jokes. And what ended up happening is by treating people as people and not just their roles, so-and-so from accounting, so-and-so from sales, people got to know each other as people. And that came back into the work environment. So when there was conflict or when there was work to be done, you were dealing with somebody you knew and appreciated in some way outside of work versus you only thought about that person in the nature of their role. That's so-and-so from accounting. They do accounting. That's not how we thought of each other as teammates in the company. We thought of each other as people who had lives and interests outside of work, and we'd probably shared a beer with and had a laugh with. And that way, if there were a challenge or consternation, it was so easy to pick up the phone and talk to them and just figure out a way through it because you knew that was a good person you were dealing with.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Breaking down those barriers and taking it away from a professional or personal context, I think, created connections and links, where these people thought of themselves as friends. And I think one of the things I remember about, the InfoScout culture and team was where you might have like a group of individuals, just, through Slack spontaneously sort of getting together and saying, hey, let's all, like, who wants to go to New York this weekend, or who wants to go to Puerto Rico, or
Right.
next week, and because you could work remote, even though, again, this is pre-COVID days we're talking
Yeah.
about, but where, like, 10, 12 people would go to Puerto Rico and rent Airbnbs and hang out together as people, but doing
Right.
work during the day, and that would just sort of arise spontaneously. And that's like a really, back to your point about, you've got culture when people start quoting sort of the values. I mean, I think by
Right.
the same token, you've created a culture of friendliness and togetherness when individuals spontaneously decide to get together to go somewhere to have a leisure trip, but be working during the day.
Yeah. Great things, right? And we didn't try to foster that, right? That wasn't an objective we had. It's just a wonderful outcome of, I think, what we ended up being able to build together as a company.
Yeah, yeah, definitely a great sort of manifestation of what you put into it. So, okay, so you brought in sort of great talent, and how do you onboard them? How do you make sure that they're trained? How do you make sure that they understand sort of what they need, functionally?
Hmm.
How do you like, get them culturally? I don't want to say assimilated because it sounds like the
Hmm.
board, but indoctrinated, or acclimatized, if you like.
Right. Yeah. So as we started hiring more and more, and the ramp was really starting to happen, one of the things we realized was that we needed to standardize the onboarding process. And so, I had the great fortune of my wife contributing to the company, and her, she used to lead a lot of the back office for us in the early days until it really started to take off. And her last act with the company was to create something we called InfoScout Academy, which was our onboarding process. And she worked with all the different team leaders to come up with a curriculum, a base curriculum of what every new employee should go through, and then customized curriculums of additional classes taught by peers in their jobs for specific roles. And so every 1 week, every month, we would hold InfoScout Academy at headquarters, and any new employee, regardless of where they were based, a home office in Cincinnati, Ohio versus coming into headquarters, they would go through InfoScout Academy together. So you had engineers, customer support, sales, finance, all these people in a room together, going through the same onboarding to really understand what is this company all about, how does it work and operate, how does the tech work, how does this work. I mean, we went deeper into areas that they probably didn't really need to know to do their job. We just always had this feeling that the more we give context to people about how this whole business works and how everything fits together, when they have to go make decisions in their own role, they're going to be less likely to make a decision that is optimized for them personally, or for their specific function, and more likely to make a decision that is optimized for the whole of the system. And I think we got tons of benefits from it. And the other thing that it did is we ended up learning that these groups that would come for a week together, they'd hang out in the evenings. Like we'd put them up in an Airbnb together. They'd get to know each other. They'd go out to dinner together. They'd go, walk up Coit Tower together and head down Lombard Street and have some Italian food. And some of us as executives would go out and join them. And just as a result of that, there was incredible camaraderie from week one, where people felt like they were a part of something, and that they really understood that they were what they were a part of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's when you think about your recruiting process and how stringent and rigorous it was in terms of identifying people, and then once you get in, then there's a sort of like a welcome to the club and a real sort of like
Mhm.
intimacy that gets created. so I can see it as a bit of a, psychologically, you're like, oh gosh, it's challenging. And, this company seems to be doing well. I hope I get in, type of thing. And then you get in, it's just like, oh, but then it's like open arms. Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to the family.
Yeah. All right, great. So when you think about culture, CEO obviously has a huge role. People / HR, talent obviously has a huge role. How do you think about culture? Like, what kind of tips would you give to, current CEOs and, founders and aspiring, entrepreneurs, in terms of like instilling a great culture? Who owns it? Who executes on it? How do you end up, spreading it and disseminating it through the company?
Yeah. You as the CEO own it more than anyone, and you have to expect your leadership team to embody it, and you have to call them out when they're not, right? You have to have the guts to say, in your next one-on-one with them or in a side message, hey, that wasn't in line with X. And then in terms of, because what they do is going to reinforce the behaviors 10x what you can do as a CEO, right? You need to embody it with them, your leadership team, and in the public face of what you do. But quite frankly, your direct reports touch a lot more people on a daily basis than you do. It's a multiplying factor. So you really have to drive that expectations in terms of how they work and operate. And the other thing you've got to do is you've got to reinforce these behaviors. So we would, when we would do shout outs for people or promote people or give awards to people, tying them back to the value that they exhibited. So not just what they did. So-and-so did this and this, and it had this kind of impact or whatever, but this really embodies what we mean by we're all entrepreneurs, or focusing on impact, for our clients, or whatever the value was. Tying things back to those makes them real versus they're just posters on a wall or something else.
Yeah, and they were actually literally posters on a wall, and they were beautiful posters, I will say. Very well designed. Mike Barnett and team did an incredible job in sort of putting those together. So they're visually very appealing, and actually, I think that probably encouraged the sort of like connection to them. Not only do you sort of believe the words, but they also look great. And then to your point, it's like, all right, how am I sort of what am I doing? Connect to those, very positive, visuals.
How do you convey that you value those values, right? You do a beautiful job designing around them. You give them prominence in regular meetings. You bring them up. You tie goals to them. You tie promotions or awards to them. You demonstrate that these are really valued versus they're just something we have to have because we're a company of a certain size, and companies of a certain size do this kind of thing.
Yeah. Very cool. So I think we're pretty much coming to the end here. I just want to when you think about growth on the one hand and culture, on the other hand, how do you think about those? Do you consider them sort of like inextricably linked? Is it possible to have growth without culture? You can almost think of like a 2x2, great culture, not great culture, great growth, not great growth. Do you think that ultimately the best growth comes from the best culture and vice versa? Or can you imagine situations where you've got great growth and not great culture, or great culture and not great growth?
Yeah. Look, we were Theranos, Uber, some of the greatest growth stories of our era. Culturally, from everything I've gathered, wouldn't want to touch those places with a 10-foot pole. Don't get me wrong, there's some great changes being made in some, in some of those places now. So I don't want to speak about them now, but in terms of, when they were fueling their growth cycles, sounds pretty miserable to me, to be frank. So can you have growth without a great culture? Yeah, but define the culture, right? Part of Uber's culture was the most common words in their job descriptions that differentiated their job descriptions from others was whatever it takes. So there was this, natural language processing done on with some machine learning on all the different job postings from all the different companies to figure out what is it that distinguishes some companies from others. And Uber's during their crazy growth phase was whatever it takes. Well, guess what? That's what they got. They got people who would do whatever it took, even if it was unethical, immoral, hurt other people, you name it, illegal. So yeah, you can, but I think there's consequences to that. And I would much rather be a part of a company with a great culture that's also growing. And I think they have symbiosis, right? It's not an either or, it's not a trade-off. You can be anywhere on the quadrant of good to bad culture and low to high growth rate, but wouldn't we all rather be in that in that upper right quartile?
Yeah, I think to your point, it ultimately comes down to a personal decision, right? It's like, who are we as people, and what kind of company do we want to create?
Oh, it's exactly right. It's exactly right. So, look, do I think culture is important? Absolutely. Is it the critical way to grow? Well, I think there's plenty of case studies that say it's not, but those case studies also show that maybe they're not so sustainable, and a lot of good people get hurt in the process if you don't create a good culture from the start. So why not do it right?
Yeah, and to your point, the legacy of InfoScout's obviously very positive in that regard, in the sense that Numerator and InfoScout now being in the larger Numerator, continues to be a not only sustainable, but like a very growing disruptive force in market intelligence. And it's not hard to see how InfoScout has strongly contributed that, not only from a product, but also from a personnel and culture perspective. And that's not in any way diminishing, obviously, the contributions of the market track.
Not at all. Not at all. No,
it's bringing everybody together, and we could do a whole other session on
sure.
The integration and the cultural elements of bringing together market track and InfoScout. But
the only other thing I add, though, is that your clients and the marketplace end up getting windows into your company culture through your employees. You can't hide your company culture for that long. It gets out into the marketplace. So having a great culture makes it all the more likely that prospects and companies in the marketplace want to work with you versus not. So don't just think of a culture as an entirely insular internal thing. It seeps its way out into the market with customers, prospects, partners, you name it, and your competition. And you certainly don't want them leveraging it against you.
It's like that old adage about body language. It's like, I can't hear what you're saying because your body is speaking. You're sort of like, how you're projecting yourself is speaking so loudly to me.
Right. That's a good one.
All right. So Jared, awesome. Thank you very much. Incredible insight here, for entrepreneurs and CEOs and founders, and, whatever the level, whether you're a CEO, especially useful for CEOs, but generally, I think for any kind of leader in an early stage company, or frankly, anyone who's working in an early stage company. Really appreciate your sharing these here with us today.
Pleasure, Alex. Great to partner with you again. You've always been a valued business partner, and I love what you're doing here. So it's great to just kind of pass it forward.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Anything you want to, any last parting words on sort of what you're doing next? You've had an incredible sort of like track record to date. I know you're working on some interesting projects. Anything you want to share?
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of heads up on how we're going to see Jared Schrieber in the future.
I think two things. One is trying to take all the learnings from working with hundreds of consumer goods brands on what does it take to really grow a brand. I think there's so much misinformation out there in terms of what are the levers you can pull, what kind of results can you expect, and we have all the data from the work that we've done over the last few years in terms of what really moves the needle. And so pulling that together and offering brands a better guide to growth and a new framework for how to think about growth. And then second, I've gotten a lot more active as an angel investor and startup advisor, something I'm just very passionate about. Hopefully that comes through, and so you should expect me to be doing a lot more of that in the years to come.
Very cool. Should aspiring angels reach out to you, or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm happy to network. Very, very simply. I'm very fortunate. I had some successful entrepreneurs who shared some great wisdom with me early on that made all the difference for me, avoiding some traps and pitfalls and mistakes and overcoming hurdles that I was facing. And so if there's any way I can pay it forward for somebody else down the road, I'd welcome that opportunity.
Well, I think this, this brief interview here is going to be a good start in that regard. And obviously, it's only a pale sort of like, comparison to what someone can get from actually working with you directly. So highly encourage, if anyone's in the space of market intelligence or AI and data and, in any of the areas that are, helping brands grow, hard for me to imagine someone that could be, a better sort of business partner and able to provide insights than Jared. So highly recommend reaching out to him.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. All
All
right.
right.
Have a
Cheers.
great day. Thanks
Thanks
for
so
your time.
much.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.